I'm hosting or chairing this panel, concurrent session B, Whose Resources, Energy, Royalties, and Collective Ownership. And I feel deeply honored and privileged to be here hosting this particular panel, made up of Craig Makinaw and Linda Maniguns. Linda will speak first, so we are again reversing the order as we did in the last panel. Linda is a member of the Blackfoot Confederacy. She has a PhD and has been a researcher for the Treaty and Land Claims Commission in Ottawa. She is currently at the University of Lethbridge in the Native Studies Department teaching Aboriginal law courses. She also continues to dabble as an artist and crafter of traditional Blackfoot clothing and items, and the standout to my eyes in this biographical blurb was a proud grandmother of 4. Craig Makinaw is Cree from Ermineskin Cree Nation and is the Alberta Regional Chief for the Assembly of First Nations. So welcome to both Craig and Linda. And I've introduced them both, so they will both speak in succession, and then afterwards we will take Q&A. So Linda, welcome.
It's a pleasure to be here, and it's an honor to actually be able to present our interpretation of collective ownership. I thought I would start with that subject in order to answer the larger question. So I'll take you through a historical background. My sense is, as I was putting together this presentation, that there's actually 3 significant stages that we went through since contact in regards to resources and resource sharing. Okay, so let me take you through this, and certainly you're welcome to ask all the questions you want later on. Okay, Aboriginal people, to start with, have always and consistently, and even to today, always held the position that any of the agreements that we made with the British were done with the notion in mind of sharing resources. Okay, that has been captured in many historical documents in the 1600s and 1700s, right? That shifted over time, and I'll explain the shift as we go. That collective agreement was set aside over time, and a unilateral attitude about the ownership over resources then took place. That is now shifting again to a more collective notion as a result of the court cases that have gone through, that we have won. Okay, so I will take you through this, and it's very brief because we're traveling through time here at about 100 years a minute. So forgive me. Phase 1 was the longest period of time in Canada. Okay, we're talking 1492 right up to the North American Act, which was in 1867. Okay, so that's 400 years that this notion of shared resources was thoroughly entrenched in the negotiations and the relationships that we developed. There was mutual recognition of that position on both sides, okay? The question at that point, for that entire period of time, was never, ever one in regards to whether or not Aboriginal people own those resources. These are examples of those agreements, okay? The one is called the two-row wampum, okay? The other one with the image in the center is one bowl, one spoon, okay? With the two-row wampum, what it represents is the one set of colored beads is the British people would stay in the land. The land is represented by the whole wampum belt, and they would have their laws and their governance, and the Indigenous people would have their laws and their governance. And we would live side by side and share the resources. The other belt, the one dish wampum belt, is very similar, okay? The image in the center represents the resources. It means that the one dish is the resources, and we will share it together, okay? That context was with us right up until the British North America Act. That was what we believed was happening. The first very important, significant document that actually entrenched those ideas was the Royal Proclamation written back in 1763. That Royal Proclamation is now entrenched in your Constitution, 1982. So that's a consistent promise that has been made to us in regards to our relationship and the sharing. However, it kind of went off the rails over time, okay? The circumstances around the Royal Proclamation were very interesting as well. There were conferences that were held at that period of time with over 2,000 to 3,000 chiefs attending around the Niagara Lakes area in order to get the agreement to draft these documents. Significant input by the Aboriginal people. At that point, they still recognize the fact that all the resources belong to Aboriginal people. Okay, I'll go back to that too. The last point on that is that at the time of the Royal Proclamation, and even to today, the only way that the British or any country can actually take land and resources from Aboriginal peoples is either by war, by treaty, or to declare that there's nobody there. Okay, those are standards, international standards that still exist. Okay. Phase 2 happened, right, at the British North America Act, its implementation, recognition of Canada, per se, right up until 1975, when the first modern treaty was drafted, okay? During that period of time, Aboriginal people were reduced to wards, couldn't sign documents, were not even considered persons in Canada, and none of their resources were considered theirs, okay? The sovereign, Canada, claimed that it now owned all the resources, birds, animals, and waters, okay? All of this was an instant, almost with like turning a light switch on, an absolute denial with no discussion whatsoever of the mutual agreements being terminated, or that the Indigenous collective ownership of the treaties would be shared. If you recall, with the two-row wampum and with the one dish, that meant that we were willing to share our resources with the British government, okay? Suddenly, as soon as the 1876 period came, now all of the resources belonged to the government. There was no more collective agreement or collective ownership of the resources, okay? The rejection of all Aboriginal rights occurred during that period of time, and recognition of Aboriginal title was absolutely not on the agenda in any government discussion. Total ownership of all the lands, birds, and animals took place at that time, including the Natural Resource Transfer Acts, which were drafted by the federal government in order to place ownership over these resources in the hands of provinces, okay? So Alberta received a National Resource Transfer Act in 1930, and so it became the owner now of these resources in the province, okay? Phase 3 happened with the modern treaties, okay? Modern treaties started, the first one would occur in 1975. It's the fastest treaty that has ever been drafted in our history. It only took 3 years because they really wanted that hydro plant in there. And they just drafted it and promised whatever was necessary. But it also opened that dialogue for the first time with Indigenous people recognizing that they do own the property that they wanted to put the James Bay hydro plant in. Since that period of time in 1982, there's been the entrenchment and recognition of the existing Aboriginal rights. I'm fairly certain that the government really thought that it was just, might only be maybe dancing or calling yourself Native or something like that. Since that entrenchment of the Constitution, we have been able to expand those rights and define them, and to start to interpret what existing means. That has unfolded into the Calder case, for instance, it was a landslide case. It was really not one, it was 3 votes against and 3 votes for, and one decision that was voted on a technicality, and so he didn't vote. But 3 of the greatest minds in Canadian legal history voted in favor of the Aboriginal interest in the land. As a result of that, there's been a groundswell around the world in regards to Indigenous people actually being able to claim that they still hold an interest in the land. The next case was Sparrow, very important because that case showed that Aboriginal peoples' rights are not attached to the land, that you can have rights to fishing and hunting that are not necessarily attached to the land. Then Guerin was heard, and that one was absolutely critical because it now placed a responsibility on the federal government for maintaining our interest in the land and respecting it. Okay, so it started to all unfold in the 70s. And then finally, the last case, less than a year and a half ago, the Twingot case, that one has been the most remarkable. What that has done, and I predict, and this is just my prediction, is that we are actually at the end of the treaty period. Okay? What this case did was this tiny little group of people, and you have to remember these little bands that are presenting these cases are less than 300 people usually, okay? They were able to establish their territorial boundaries and where they had traditionally held their land. The chiefs once a year would go around the land and put their feet in certain spots and sing their song. Some of those places where they did that every single year, the footprint marks where they put their feet in order to sing their songs were so deep it went down up to their knees. That's how long they've been there on that territory. But the Supreme Court of Canada said that they recognize not only an interest, but that they still hold title. So they don't have to write treaty with the government. As a result of that, all across the eastern seaboard, where there are no treaties, where treaties are being negotiated up north, and I know of several of my students who are actually stopping the treaty negotiations because they can just keep their land and they're sovereign. So this whole notion of whose resources are they really is clearly established in our history. It's clearly established that we need to get back to the negotiating table, and we need to get back to an Aboriginal way of looking at resources and of sharing the land in a way that will respect the earth. Our Indigenous people lived on this land in a way that was considered uncivilized. Uncivilized because they didn't plow down the earth, they didn't chop down the trees. Their value, their systems, their ideologies were intended to be able to live within nature and be able to ensure that their children in the future would get the land in better condition than when they were on it. So they would never even break a branch of a tree. They would never overharvest. They would never have an abundance of children unless everybody talked about what their population would be. They lived with the environment in order to ensure that we weren't a burden on the animals and the plants and the earth. And so we really want to have those discussions again, and I believe that that's the genuine interest of our Aboriginal peoples in order to ensure our future in regards to resources. Okay, I'll leave it at that, and I'll let my my supporter here.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank the organizers of this lecture today for inviting us here today to discuss the issues that we're talking about today, revenue sharing. As you all, maybe you're not aware right now that the royalty review is going on for the province of Alberta right now at the present time, and I know we've been invited as organizations to go speak there at town hall meetings, but personally myself, I don't agree with those kind of settings because that's not really the right way to sit and talk about issues, because those types of meetings, they take the information from those meetings that sometimes are just comments that aren't, how would you say, thought out right, or our legal positions aren't brought into those meetings. So I always am hesitant to sit at those type of sessions because, as a lot of you are aware, when you sit in those meetings and speak, the government of Alberta and the government of Canada always take that as consultation. And when you don't do your consultation right, down the road it ends up being court cases because you need to sit down at the table like my previous speaker spoke. We need to sit down and talk about these issues and come to an understanding. So I just thought I'd bring that up. And I guess the other one would be too is I was involved in January 2012, I'll know more when all that stuff was happening in Ottawa. The Alberta Chiefs went to that meeting, and that was a really politically charged, really almost violent meetings because we had disagreements from chiefs across the country in dealing with at that time the issues, and a lot of that stemmed from C38 and C45. That's to start everything from there, and so we ended up as an Alberta delegation, Treaty 6, Treaty 7, and Treaty 8 chiefs, Grand Chiefs. I was one of them that went to that meeting with the Prime Minister, and there was about 3 or 4 different regional chiefs from the country there, and then we sat there with the Prime Minister, the Minister at that time, Indian Affairs Minister, and we sat around the table and we discussed, I think it was about 10 issues, and one of those issues that we brought up at that time was revenue sharing, and we asked Prime Minister Harper at that time about revenue sharing, and what he said to us then was, you go back to your province, you talk to them about it. So ever since then, as previously I was the Treaty 6 Grand Chief and the Chief of Ermineskin, I've been bringing that to the table, and now that I've been elected as the AFN Alberta Regional Chief on July 1st this year, I have a 3-year term, so I'm going to be bringing this issue further to the table to at least come to some conclusion, because it's been talked about for years, and on all these agreements that we've dealt with our CAs, because I'm kind of not going by what's written here. I'm just going by my experience as a chief and a councillor, because one of the things the government is famous for, I guess I could say, is see our yearly, they're called comprehensive funding agreements. That's where we get our money from Ottawa yearly. And what they do is, instead of, we've always, at our band level at Ermineskin, we've always asked the government, can we sit and negotiate the terms and conditions of the agreement? And what happens all year is we sit, we talk. We don't come to a conclusion. So when it comes to January of the next year, a new agreement is sent to you with no consultation. So right from January 1st till the end of March, we're talking about the terms and conditions of the agreement. And most of the time, those agreements, we might get some wording that we like, but a lot of the time we don't get what we're trying to get in those wordings, because a lot of our positions for a lot of the organizations were the treaty-based argument based on the treaty, and that's how a lot of us are. When we come to the table, we talk about our treaty, and as our previous speaker said, we, right from 1867 when the first treaty was done till now, we've always had gone about that position of treaty, and we always use that when we come to the table. But unfortunately, a lot of the bands that don't have resources can't fight the government in the boardroom because they don't have the funds to do it. So they end up signing those agreements. And a lot of times those terms and conditions of those agreements aren't in their favor. So especially the bands that don't have resources, the bands that do have resources can fight the government and try and get the terms and conditions that they want. And so that's what we face as organizations on a yearly basis. And they always given us options on how to deal with these agreements, whether it's 1-year agreement, 3-year agreement, 5-year agreement, or 10-year agreement. But once you sign off on those agreements, you're locked in. You really don't have much say and more negotiating power to deal with the government on the yearly agreements when they get brought in. So my band, Urban Skins, just south of here, has always went with a 1-year agreement ever since these last 15, 20 years. We've always stuck with that position of always going to a 1-year agreement because we don't like the terms and conditions of those agreements, and they're not in our favor. So, but those are just some of the things that we do on a yearly basis as governments, and I'm hoping that now with this new federal government and the provincial government, that things will improve. I know we've heard Premier Otley say some good words, and then working with us, and then the Prime Minister has said some comments to in the media. So it's hopeful that for the future that we'll get things done. And as you're all aware, the Prime Minister has sent out mandate letters to all his ministers. So I take that as a 4-year position for the government to work with either with us, Native organizations, or industry, or the provinces. So I'm going to be looking at that as something that we can look at and use at their mandates as something that we can work with in all those different areas that the Prime Minister has spoken. So, but going back to revenue sharing here in Alberta, what I was going to mention was until we get this royalty review sorted out and negotiated with the province, eventually, what we'd like to see is more programs and services coming out of that, because I know there's jurisdictional issues between the federal government and the province, and until those issues get settled with, and one of our main topics that needs to be addressed is the NRTA from 1930 when it was drafted, because when it was drafted, there was only one Native representative at the table, and it was one of our elders that was at the meeting. Like when you go to a meeting, you don't draft. It's not good negotiating to only have one person at the table, especially if it's an elder, because we value our elders, but you shouldn't use our elders in that way. So I always have a contention with that with our NRTA, because it needs to be brought back to the table, and then once that gets addressed, the revenue sharing will get dealt with later. But I'm really hoping that once this royalty review gets done and we sit down at the table and talk about these issues, that all these other issues, programs and services will get addressed. I know in my paper here, it has a lot of those things that I was going to talk about, and a lot of those items will be based on the revenue sharing, and once that gets dealt with, then these things will fall into place. Because we deal with two levels of government, both the federal and the provincial, on different issues. So we always are at the table, whether it's federally or provincially, and issues within the province. We've started talking to the premier and her ministers, so I'm hopefully that will continue. And once we get to, I'm hoping by within a year's time, we'll see some progress, either both federally and provincially. So I'm really hopeful that things will get better for us in the future, and especially with all these issues. I know you've all heard, like murdered, missing Indigenous women, the TRC report, all those other items that are on the table right now. Those are things that we need to address. So with my presentation here, I don't really want to talk about it too much because a lot of it is for the future. And until we get to that table and talk about those issues, hopefully we'll get there and we can discuss them, and better to work together, because as our population is getting bigger, we're over 1 million people now in Canada, and both provincial and federal elections show that when our people do decide to vote, they helped out, because with the federal election, there was a 270% increase in voters across the country, and that never has happened before. And the federal election 4 years ago, there was 8 Aboriginal candidates got in. This election, there's 10. And so as our population gets bigger, I think we're going to see more Aboriginal candidates in Ottawa, and especially when our neighboring province and the Northwest Territories, the members in some areas are getting to be more than 50% Aboriginal or Métis, or Aboriginal or Inuit. The population is getting bigger, so as their population gets bigger, there's going to be more candidates coming in. So I see more people coming in, and as we move along, and maybe about 40 or 50 years, I wouldn't be surprised if an Aboriginal member is the Prime Minister of Canada down the road. Because I see too, with all the immigrants and all the people that are coming into Canada, the racism issue is getting less and less. That's what I see. And because the country is getting more racial tolerant, more open to talking to different people from different countries. So I see that as a positive. And the racism issue, I see it down the road as it's not going to be as bad as it was years ago, because it's starting to get better, I think. And, with the way all these issues are being brought out and talked about, I see a lot of benefits down the road for all of us. So I guess with that, I'd just like to thank all of you and for hearing me. And if you have any questions, I'll take them too. But a lot of mine would be on the political side, and sometimes I do analytical side too when we do political work. So with that, I'd just like to thank all of you for listening, and have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for Q&A.
Is it on? Hello? Yeah. Chief Makinaw, Dr. Manyguns, thank you very much. My name is Ian Huzzy. I work for the Parkland Institute. I do research for the Institute. I don't believe our conference coordinator, Samantha Powers, in the room, but she said something to me the other day, and I want to raise a question she had to you. And it is about the political side, also the legal side. And that is, our Premier is talking about how we implement the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous People. What does that mean to you in political and legal terms to do that?
Well, I guess as you're all aware, it has been announced by the Premier that they're going to be, well, presently they're looking at the UN Declaration, how it fits in with the province in all areas and all programs. And they're going to be making a report in February of next year. So as you've been hearing, and I guess one of the ones that I've kind of interested me was the Minister of Human Services making the comment that his program is going to look at both the UN Declaration and the TRC recommendations and how it fits in to child services. So, you know, if the province is going to do that and use both the UN Declaration and the TRC recommendations, you know, if they look at that, both those reports, there's a lot of things that will need to be worked on, and it's going to take some time. So it's going to be an interesting time for all of us once we hear that report and other reports that are coming from the federal government.
The TRC is looking to the UN Declaration as a framework in order to implement its recommendations. The UN Declaration recognizes Indigenous rights, not just as a human right issue, but rights as nations, rights as individual communities who have their own legal systems, who have their own cultural values integrated into the way we live, and recognition of those rights and values as a part of a way of life, and the revisement of the systems that surround us at present.
Chief Makinaw, I would appreciate a clarification. With the current government in Alberta, are you sitting at the table in the royalty review under the conditions that you would want and need?
Okay, when I made comment earlier when we got invited to sit at these town hall meeting settings, and as I said earlier, I don't agree with that kind of a setting. But what I wrote in that letter was that until I get the direction from the three treaty heirs, 3, 6, 7, and 8 Grand Chiefs, because I work as the AFN Alberta Regional Chief, I work for 3, 6, 7, and 8, which is 43 bands in the province and 3 Grand Chiefs. So until some of those outstanding issues, like the treaty issue, the inherent rights, the NRTA, I'm not comfortable coming to the table to talk about the royalty review until we can sit down and talk about those issues. So I made that known already. I sent a letter to the panel that I don't want my comments to be construed as consultation too, because I know once you get to those town hall meetings and you speak, your comments are used against you. And I know down the road, if it doesn't get addressed, I'll see a court. I'll see one of the bands taking the province to court, and it wouldn't surprise me if that does happen in this next year. But I'm hoping that doesn't happen, because we've gone to court too many times over the years. There's been millions spent, and it's time now to start talking and try and deal with the issues. Okay. Okay.
Sir, you have
I wonder if each of you could review for me what resource sharing meant. When the Royal Proclamation was made, I have like an idea that, okay, so animals and the river going through is shared. But when we talk about, let's say rock oil, that wasn't even known about when the Royal Proclamation was made, and later, we've got Imperial Oil and all the companies pumping out oil from underneath First Nations territory, What does the original resource sharing mean? Like, if it's under, like for oil in particular, if it was under First Nations territory, then shouldn't there be no sharing?
When the Royal Proclamation was drafted and the idea of resource sharing was mutually understood, those ideas are permitted in accordance with the cases that we've won to evolve. Okay, so we drive cars, we watch TV, and that doesn't diminish our Aboriginalness. And so when we talk about resource sharing, we talk about resource sharing in today's world. Today, as a result of the NRTA's, the National Resource Transfer Acts, here in the province of Alberta, for instance, in Edmonton here, they collect all the revenues from timber and lumber and oil and whatnot. And based on your population count, it's administered and divided up amongst all your municipalities so that you can have roads and schools like this. None of the reserves get that. We don't get any of those resources. Okay. Any of the revenues that are transferred from Ottawa in order to support our services on the reserves, each person in a province gets, according to stats counts, $17,000 is sent to the provinces per person in order to support your roads and services, etc. Each reserve only gets $10,000, and they have to provide everything without any of the provincial resources. So resource sharing, last time I heard, paved roads and decent schools didn't affect Indianness. And the only provincial laws that are not supposed to be applied on the reserves are those that would affect Indianness. So it's probably just a matter of time before litigation actually takes care of those limitations that are currently enforced by provinces. Okay.
Yes, thanks very much for clarifying the history, which I'm continuing to learn more about. I'm wondering, this person who's interested in a greener economy, a just transition away from the fossil fuel-based economy. And of course, you're probably aware of a couple of examples internationally, for example, Ecuador, where there's some effort to actually keep the oil in the ground. I'm also aware that, for example, a place that I once taught, which was down at a place called Mesquachis, used to be called Obima, that there's a lot of oil revenue there. To get to the point, my question, I'm wondering how would greater control of resources, revenues, royalties, etc., for First Nations be used? Do you see them being used more heavily towards creating this just transition? For example, solar energy projects, wind energy projects, that sort of thing. I'm wondering if the revenues, once they become more fairly distributed, would that happen?
Well, I know with the solar part and renewable resources, I've been in discussion with a couple organizations and looking at, especially the solar part of it, and rechargeable batteries. So right now, a lot of these things are in discussion right now, and probably within the next year, you'll hear some announcements, hopefully from both the provincial and federal government, that they're going to support these initiatives. All the bands in Alberta are looking at presently because, as you're all aware, Fort McMurray, there's a lot of environmental issues there. There's some health issues in some of those local bands there. So, and even a lot of the bands up in Treaty 8 are looking at these new options, especially the renewable energy type projects. So you're going to see a shift. And what we're talking about, once these, especially the solar part area gets established, we're hoping that either not a committee, but something like the EUB will have an Aboriginal division there, or either that, or with Indian Oil and Gas Canada out of Calgary, that there'll be another area there. So it's in the works right now. So hopefully by next year at this time, you'll hear more initiatives that are going to happen.
I'll just add a little bit more. One of the things to keep in mind when you talk or think about any of the resources that we have on the reserves, all of those are legislated under the Indian Act. We don't get the revenues that anybody else does, like the province, etc. It's extremely controlled. We're not allowed to even gather up a bag of gravel without getting the minister's approval. And anything that is gathered, mining, timber, or oil, is legislated and controlled very rigorously.
Thank you for your presentations, both of you. I'd just like to go back to the history of what I learned today is that the 1492 to 1867 period, the BNA Act, the question of Aboriginal resource ownership was not raised. Is it merely a coincidence, or is it actual planning that in 1867, which was only 9 years after the discovery of oil in Canada, in Western Ontario, that they decided to change everything and move to a system where they could control those resources owned or beneath the land or lands of the First Nations?
Of course, our land has been the goal. I mean, that's been the problem is that there's only 11 treaties that were drafted, and those are all in the central area where the train was going through in order to get populations out to the west. Now that modern treaties are being drafted, and with the Tlingit case, there's a good possibility that the resources will be considered owned by all of the Indigenous populations out in the east, Labrador, Newfoundland, a lot of the territories up in the north, etc. So just the question of ownership becomes debatable in many of the corners of Canada. So.
I guess what I'd like to add on too is when before the NRTA was drafted, the money was sent right to Ottawa on all our timber and other stuff, and the money has been sitting in Ottawa. This is kind of like a point of contention with a lot of us. We have an account in Ottawa. It's called Indian Monies, and we'd like to look at that as an option for us to try and get some more dollars for our bands across the country, for us 633 bands. Because from what we're hearing, that money from Indian Monies has been there since 1867, and it's sitting in Ottawa. And yeah, so yeah, it's over. From what we're hearing, it's in the trillions. And if those dollars could be freed, and we could be able to provide services for our members in our bands, but because we do know that there was a case in the States where the Bureau, they're called the Bureau of Indian Affairs in U.S., lost to some bans on a case for trust funds, and I think it was over $900 million about 10 years ago, I think. So I see that as something to talk about when that does come up. I'm not sure when, but it's something that down the road, if you hear about it, don't be surprised because it's still going to be brought up, and I don't know when the time will be, but there's going to be some discussion on it, hopefully before this new government's term comes to an end. So I'm really hopeful that things will get better for all of us.
I just wanted to say again how informative both of your presentations have been and the questions in particular. But what I was hearing so much of was that any gains that have been had have been really not only just struggled for and through litigation and through that process, but so often even the process that you were talking about, Chief Makinaw, about having to wait for these terms and conditions to be dictated and having to then respond on that basis. So much of it is about the agenda being set on the part of the provincial and federal governments and through the frameworks that are already in place on their terms. What needs to happen in order to shift that so that Aboriginal peoples are setting the agenda on these issues of resources in particular?
Well, with the way the agreements are written, the government is the one that dictates the terms and conditions. And I always see these comprehensive funding agreements as, I think they first started in 1945 from what I hear from talking with elders. And at that time, the first original CFA agreement was a treaty-based agreement. And the terms and conditions there were more in our favor. And until we get back to that stage where we get back to the treaty-based agreements, then we'll be able to get some progress. And I'm always hopeful that we can get to that stage, because I know years ago when our leaders used to meet with the government, there used to be shouting matches at the table, and now I see where we're more business-like, more wanting to get things done. So I'm hoping that we'll do that for the future for us. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you for your presentations. I suppose this question is for both of you, but I'll start with Chief Makinaw, because you referred to the mandate letters that Trudeau had emphasized he wants to develop a new relationship with First Nations people. And he's mentioned this previously, so it really seems sincere. But I want to raise a question mark. Is this really Trudeau and the Liberals seeing the light and wanting to end the colonial relationship and have a relationship of equality? Or is it Trudeau seeing where Harper messed up being so ham-fisted on Bill C-38 and 45, that some people might be skeptical, if not cynical, that if you develop and cultivate these relationships, that you might be able to do things that Harper wasn't able to do, such as pipelines and extracting resources. So where do you stand on this? How do you read the Trudeau government's emphasis on the recognition and the importance of establishing better relationships with Canada's First Nations people?
Okay. Well, I know when the new federal government got elected into Ottawa with those letters to the ministers, I've been asked by different media organizations to comment on our relationship with the federal government. And what my answer up to now has been, give us some time to sit down with them, and I can probably give you a better answer within a year's time, because I see similarities both between the federal government and provincial government, because they're kind of talking in the same way. So I'm kind of not skeptical, but we'll see within a year, because I can't really give you a straightforward answer now how both governments are going to deal with us, especially the federal government. Within a year's time, I'll have a better idea on which way we're going and how we're working with the government. So right now, I can't really give you a good answer on that. Yeah, next year I'll be back. You invite me.
Hi, thank you for all your thoughts. My question is in regards to collective ownership and how that can be done in a way that actually addresses power and privilege differentials that currently exist and historically have existed. Because when we look at examples of co-management, for example, it's all lip service. So how can we actually do it in a just way that is actually equitable?
Okay, how do we do that in a way that's going to address the hierarchical systems that exist? Well, there's no magic answer, that's for sure. I believe that due to the recognition of title to the land bases, I believe that has seriously impacted the political agenda for provincial and federal governments. They realize how much of the territories they didn't put under treaty. We had land claims all across Canada, thousands of them, as a result of recognition of our title. And the government would only negotiate 6 at a time, and some of them would take up to 20 years to negotiate. And when they were asked why they wouldn't handle more, they said, we'll do it at our pleasure. So they've dragged their heels on it, and now our title has been recognized. Now they're changing their mind. Now they're finally, gee, maybe we will talk to you. Maybe you guys, might actually be willing to sit down with us. So I guess the question is the way in which the nations that don't have treaties decide to deal with their natural resources will be the next stage in this. I believe that our philosophies and our value system of not taking more than you need will actually animate most of the decisions in the treaty that was done with for the hydro plant in Quebec. There was a second part to it. It was called the Great Whale, and it was turned down. Aboriginal people will not allow excessive development to the point where it destroys their lands or land bases. Having said that, I've actually seen some mapping projects that were absolutely phenomenal. And so you have a resource on the land that was wanted. It was harvesting timber, and there was resistance from the Aboriginal group and from some environmentalists on that particular land base. So some very innovative thinkers actually brought the groups together, and they had the Aboriginal people show them on the map what parts of the land they were concerned about and why. And what they did was they mapped the migration routes of certain animals so that the animals would be protected. And then they asked the environmentalists what on this particular piece of land was a concern for you, and there were particular species of trees and vegetation that needed protected. So they mapped those areas out, and then everybody agreed that the harvesting could go on in areas where the animals would be protected and certain species would. So there's no reason to believe that it stops everything. It's just that it would be done in a way that everything would be respected. So it would be about respect.
I guess going back to your collective question, I know that's always been a question at our table, because there's always individual and collective rights, and the way the band system is set up, it's collective. And a lot of the decisions are based on the collective. And I don't know if you're aware, but in the States, a lot of the bands there are called checkerboard reserves. And this is where we have a concern. I know if the previous government were going to would have got back in, we heard that they were going to bring in legislation to have more individual rights based on the land. And what we have a big concern and worry about that is if that ever does happen, we're going to fall into the same system as the U.S. tribes, where some band members sell their land, and that's why they call them collective checkerboard reserves, because you'll have a band member living here and a non-band member living there, and as you go through the band, you'll see how it looks. So that's something that we're really concerned about, and I don't think a lot of the chiefs will ever agree with going to that individual land base and land agreements unless it's more of a collective, and that's how most of the bands deal with their decisions, especially when it comes to land and property rights.
I have 2 points of inquiry. I wouldn't mind hearing opinions or input about your thoughts on the colonial code that was developed under the last federal Liberal government. And the second thing was, would either of you want to comment on the current state of the Lubicon tribe?
Well, in regards to the colonial accord, we've heard comments that the federal government is going to look at that again. So we'll see in the next few months if that's going to happen, because I know the previous Prime Minister, Martin, had some conditions on there that were favorable to us. So I'm hoping that that accord does come to the table and then we can discuss that. And with the Lubicon band, I know it's that one is because there's 2 different groups there at Lubicon. There's the recognized band, and then there's the previous chief Ominiak. And that one is kind of a contentious issue because the Department of Indian Affairs has got involved into their band politics. And usually when they have disputes like that, the band take care of it themselves, either internally, or the last resort is to go to court and have it dealt with there. Because talking to some legal people, until the previous chief Ominiak's issues on Lubicon get dealt with, I don't ever see that issue taken care of, because right now, as things are happening, the new chief and council that are there are dealing with the industry right now and getting things done. So it's going to take some time, I think, with the Lubicon until the federal government deals with it, because I know it already has gone to the UN and the United Nations know about the issue. So it's all up to Canada now to deal with it, and I'm hopefully they'll deal with it in the right way.
Thank you. I enjoyed both of your talks, but I was fascinated by when you mentioned about Indian monies. And are you sure that money's there? Or is it just on paper? And if it is in the trillions of dollars, you're as rich as Norway.
Yes, except we don't have it.
Well, with Indian monies, it has been brought up, but the government doesn't have the dollars to give it to us, because that's a lot of dollars. And until they ever find those dollars to give to us, I don't see it happening for a while. And unless somebody decides to push the issue and take it to court, then maybe we might see something happen there. But as with all court cases, it takes anywhere from 5 to 10 years to come to a decision. So it's going to be a future issue. It's not going to, nothing's going to happen right away, but I'd encourage all of you to read more about the Indian monies so you'll have a better understanding of it, because there's a misconception on with us of that $9 billion we get every year on our CFAs, because the Canadian Taxpayers Federation always says that's tax dollars, but it's not, because those dollars we say comes from the Indian monies. So there's been a misconception to the public, and if you have time on your own, read the Onion Lake decision on that just happened recently on Bill C-27, and it makes mention of the Indian monies there. And the judge has made some comments on it. And once you read it, you'll kind of have a better understanding of where a lot of us are when it comes to Indian monies. So especially that the way the Canadian Taxpayers Federation has been saying things.
Yeah, there's a lot of misperceptions about money, taxes, etc. I know we get $5 a year for our land, and we have to apply for that. We don't just get our $5 a year. I applied for it once. I had to fill out all these forms, and they still ripped me off for $20. So.